Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, you look phenomenal today. See what happens when you subscribe? You get a bonus greeting on every episode. On this episode, we talked to Professor Todd Haugh from my alma mater, Indiana University. He runs the ethics program at the Kelley School of Business, and we get into all kinds of stuff. He's a real forward thinker. He runs a really cool center at Indiana University that you should check out, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hey, Todd.
Hey there. How are you?
Good, man. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. How are things?
Things are good, man. We got a rare snowstorm coming through Charlotte, so everybody's in a panic. The grocery stores all look like COVID is hitting again.
Yeah, we have that as well. We had about 15 inches over the last couple of days, and we got another 3 or 4 coming today. So it's a little nuts here. Yeah,
beautiful. Well, we got connected on LinkedIn. I saw a post somebody shared of yours. You're kind of famous for always sharing what you're reading, and I saw that you run the program at my alma mater. So I was excited to get you on and connect with you, man.
Yeah, likewise. And before we get started, how's your health and how are things?
Good. Look at that. Look at that range of motion. I'm getting it back. I can check my blind spots again. That's crazy, which is great. Yeah, it's crazy. It was a crazy.
I mean, I can't imagine going through that, but you were, sort of documenting it and doing these type of things while you're also dealing with that is pretty incredible. So I'm glad to hear that things are all going well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, the holidays were kind of extra special this year because they could have just been so different,
Yeah.
So how did you get into this game, Todd?
So I started my career as a practicing attorney. So I practiced white collar criminal defense work in Chicago for about a decade before I got into academia. And so, represented everybody from like CEOs to secretaries, basically, and really got interested. That was kind of my first foray into understanding why good people do bad things and how that affects an organization and what the, really serious consequences of that can be down the road.
So was that an area that was interesting to you when you were in law school, that you're like, I really wanted to get into that?
Yeah, I was always interested in criminal law. I always thought I would be, a prosecutor, defense attorney at some point. And then I took a white collar crime class, and that was kind of like the perfect fit of my interests. A little bit of business, a little bit of psychology. Obviously there's the criminal component. And so, I got interested in that, doing litigation for sure, but then focusing more specifically on white collar crime. And then the first job I had out of law school was at a boutique white collar firm in Chicago. So it's pretty much all we did was represent, people involved in the criminal justice system from a white collar side.
So what kind of stuff was that? Like, that must have been so interesting, right? I mean, you said you did that for a decade. I bet you have 1,000 stories from that.
I have a lot of good stories. Some you can't tell because they're not public, but listen, Chicago is if you're interested in white collar crime, Chicago is a good place to be. So
that's that's the hotbed.
Yeah. So we had a lot of public corruption cases, but also a lot of like run of the mill, financial accounting fraud type cases, things like that, false statements, the typical stuff that happens when business people or there's economic wrongdoing and, people get interviewed by agents and lie and things like that. And those are all crimes, of course. And so, we worked on, a bunch of the governors of Illinois, have been in trouble over the years.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so got to work on some of those cases, stock options backdating cases, Clean and Air Water Act, violation cases, anything really with like an economic context to it in the federal system as well. So that was kind of my introduction to this whole area.
So when you were doing that, like, what was the general mix of like just a sociopathic, like wicked person versus, someone kind of acting out of some like external pressure? I mean, are those kind of the two big buckets?
So if there is the bucket of the sociopath, like we think about that, like the truly evil person,
conniving, twisting his mustache guy.
That person, in my estimation or my experience, is very, very, very rare. like
Right.
few and far between. And actually it was kind of one of the reasons I think on the academic side, I wanted to understand and study this more, because the kind of popular notions out there of like wrongdoing and why people commit crime and why people commit white collar crime, like didn't really resonate with me in terms of what I was seeing on a day-to-day basis. So, I would have clients that came in and, they'd be portrayed in the news media as greedy and evil and conniving, like you're saying. And I was talking to a person who was like a really, nice person to talk to, who had a good family, who, had, was well educated, knew right from wrong, was a good churchgoer, a good whatever, in like all walks of their life. And then in this area, one particular area, they did something unethical and oftentimes illegal. And like, I was trying to understand that dichotomy, that duality of people.
Yeah, because you're kind of taught that it works one way, and then with your own eyes, you're seeing something that seems in total contradiction to it.
Yeah. I tell a story about, the client. We had lots of high profile clients over the years in the two different firms that I was at. But the client that had the biggest impact on me was just sort of like a run of the mill guy, had a kind of a consulting accounting practice, and committed bank fraud. He got pressured by a friend and allowed his friend to kind of use a bank account that he had control over. It's illegal. You can't do that.
Right.
But this guy was a great person. He still is a great person, and he just,
Right.
He took a step that he probably knew was wrong. And then, sort of that continues and you sort of cover those things up, and then you find yourself in real trouble. And that is, I think, much more common in this space than the person who sets out to, rip off the little old lady, or the, even someone as evil as, Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff didn't start out trying to rip people off. I mean, he had
it was like this little decision.
Yep.
It was a little decision, and then it started to snowball, and then before you know it, this titan of, this pillar of Wall Street is taken down like that,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's actually a really important thing. I talk to companies a lot and talk to company leaders. I think we have this sense that we can pick out those, those bad people or those bad apples in our organization, and we can get rid of them, or we would never hire them in the first place, right? Because,
exactly.
Because we're good people, and so we're going to surround ourselves with other good people. And you realize that that's kind of like an antiquated way of thinking about the human nature and the human condition, and certainly wrongdoing in organizations.
Yeah, it's kind of that kind of, well, there's good guys and bad guys type of binary sort of black and white thinking.
Yeah.
So
I wish it was that simple. I wish it was that simple.
Yeah, that'd be great. Here, fog this mirror. All right, you're out.
Exactly.
So walk me through that sort of decision point, that sort of crossroads you went to, because you're doing this criminal defense or white collar criminal defense work. You start seeing this sort of contradiction, or this, this difference between what you're taught and what you're actually seeing. And then at some point you got into academia, and you said, like, this guy, this contradiction is what really drove you to kind of learn some more about it. So what was it in particular? Were you like, hey, I just want to kind of like unpack this and understand it more? Or was it like, I want to come and do research to get a sort of better answer versus that sort of black and white, picture that we were talking about?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. So a lot of people leave full-time law practice because they hate being a lawyer. I was not that person. I actually enjoyed being a lawyer. I had really great experiences, but you kind of project your life out 10 or 15 years, and you're like, all right, I'm going to be kind of doing the same thing that I'm doing now, just maybe in a different capacity. And I thought I guess I'm maybe slightly more cerebral in the sense of I really wanted to understand the problems that I was dealing with, as opposed to being a little bit of a plumber, which is kind of just fixing the problems in front of you, and sometimes fixing them in a lot of the same ways. It's still, if you're a litigator and you're, practice type of law, it's still motion practice. It's still lots of deadlines. It's still kind of the same general thing.
Right.
And so I wanted to go a little bit deeper more on that question of like the why, right? Like, how does this happen? Why does this happen? So when I was practicing, I started reading a lot more like criminological research and trying to understand this from like a more of a theory perspective.
Yeah.
And then I transitioned. I did a little bit of I did a stint at the Supreme Court as a Supreme Court Fellow for a year. And so I was doing kind of like economic crime policy. And that also kind of calls on you a little bit to think a little bit broader, right? Not just how does this influence one person, but how do we think about policy and sentencing policy for lots of people, which then gets this question of, okay, what problems are we really trying to solve here, and what's the cause of those problems? And then when I transitioned into academia, my work was certainly in the beginning was all about like these theories of behavior. And then as I transitioned to a business school, because I spent a little time in law schools, but when I got to a business school, that totally opened up my eyes of like, oh wait, it's really the context in which this is happening in companies and organizations that to me felt like the real front lines of this problem that I was interested in understanding. And that's when I got really interested in to think about compliance as like a field.
So like that, like criminologist reading you were doing was really probably talking about the wiring of a human and why they might make a decision. But it seems like as you kind of got into this field a little bit more, you were like, it's really just human plus like business context or like situation or something. Yeah.
And I think, criminologists certainly are thinking about those things, but first of all, there's not as much criminological theory focused specifically on white collar offenders. It tends to focus on, I'll use this term, I don't love it, but like a street offender, you would call it. But and there's a bunch of theories about why people do what they do and why people commit crime that I don't think like match up super well with how we think of most normatively sort of law abiding folks that navigate their way through organizations, right? I mean,
what's an example of that? Of that thing.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of theories in criminology about like, your background and the strain that you have on your situation. A lot of it has to do with scarcity of resources and things like that.
Yeah,
and there is certainly something to be said for that for white collar offenders. But when I look at the theories, the one that resonates with me the most is rationalization or neutralization theory, right? Which is basically like, I have opportunity, I have pressure, and this becomes the fraud triangle, which lots of people have heard about, but it gets kind of repackaged that way. But I have opportunity, I have pressure. And then in order for that behavior to actually go forward, right, for me to have that link between kind of like a way of thinking about an unethical act and actually have that occur, I've got to rationalize that behavior. I've got to come up with an excuse essentially that says it's okay to do this bad thing. And while I could still hold myself out as a good person, right?
Yeah, I mean, we are just rationalization machines, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's kind of the point. So you figure out some way to kind of fix the frame so that you can sleep at night and say, okay, I'm not that bad of a person.
Yeah, and what a company or what an organization and a culture can do is have all kinds of impacts on that, both the rationalizations that are created, but certainly the pressures and opportunities that are happening as well. And so, like, to me, when I thought about the theories that were the best match for white collar offenders, then the next step is understanding, okay, let's go deeper into the behavioral science aspect of that, actually like what's going on in the brain and how do we make decisions, but then also what are those what's that external component? And that's culture and pressure and things like that.
Totally. Yeah, because like that rationalization can either happen in the laboratory that is your brain in this sort of sterile environment, right?
Yeah.
But that takes sort of extra calories in some sense, right? You have to sort of like create that out of nothing. Or you can look around and be like, oh, well, everyone's doing it. Or look at how those people have rationalized, and you can sort of outsource that rationalization and just plug that into your own behavior,
And I think that's the much more common way that happens, is most people don't sort of conjure up these things on their own. They grab them from kind of what's swirling around them, whether it's their family or friends, or if we're talking about organizational economic wrongdoing, it's often what's happening in our organizations with the people that are closest to us. So, our friends and colleagues in our business. And, so when you think about culture, I try to often think about it, not like a massive corporate culture, although there is a component to that, but like, what are these subcultures that are happening in an organization? Because those are the most likely to influence your decision-making and behavior.
Yeah, the culture is more like a stew than it is a broth.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's all these little micro cultures. Have you seen Succession, that show?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So everyone's been telling me to watch it, and I'm finally watching it, and I'm like, oh man, amazing. This is freaking phenomenal. Yeah. But as you were talking, I'm like in maybe season 3 right now. I've been like I've just been blasting through it. But I was just thinking about in that first season, there's that character, the cousin, and how he gets sort of sucked into this thing, and you can see the moral dilemma of him shredding these documents and how he rationalizes it and how uncomfortable he is and all of that. I mean, it's probably, on balance, it's probably a lot more like those types of situations than someone like we were saying, twisting their mustache and,
Yeah. And I'll just, relate it back a little bit to kind of my legal days. It's like, people sort of ask me like a similar question that you asked, which is, well, how many of these people were actually guilty or something like that? And I'll often say, well, all of them were probably guilty of something. There wasn't always necessarily what the government said they were guilty of, but the point here is there's usually a moment where someone has a pause about what they're doing, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it's illegal, but they probably know that it's wrong. There's some aspect of wrong, okay? There are times probably when the culture is so strong or a person is so young or just entering a new culture that they don't really understand, that it's totally blind, totally blindsided.
Yeah, sure.
But I think that's probably fairly rare too. I think most of us have a pretty good moral intuition about something's off here. And then the question though is, what causes the person to sort of pass that line? And then if that's the case, how do these little steps sort of keep building on themselves to get yourself down this road where you now know what you've been doing really is wrong and even illegal. And now it's extremely difficult to own up to that, because when you do, that's the moment that you now say, I'm no longer a good person, right? You're confronting that yourself, and that brings in all this external loss that you will face. Reputation.
Which you were trying to avoid.
Exactly. Yep. Reputation, your job, your family, your loved ones, right? Imagine telling your spouse, and, I've had clients that have had to do this, of course, right? That, hey, I've been committing a crime for the past 5 years or 2 years, or I did this and, this is illegal. Like, I need a lawyer. I might go to jail. I mean, that is an extremely difficult thing to do. I mean, just understand it from a human to human level, whether you're talking about some big crime or not. And a lot of people sort of pretend like, oh, I could do it. I would do it. I'm ethical. The answer is it's very difficult to do.
Well, it's just this chain of like marginal decisions. And but for the moment when you're actually saying it, you're kind of making an implicit decision to not say it every single moment. So
I think that's
every subsequent moment is easier to not say it, right? Because I have a longer chain behind me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. And you're right. It gets easier and easier as time goes on. And there's a million examples of that. But I saw that, all the time in law practice. And I think that aligns really well with behavioral ethics research, behavioral science research out there that would suggest the same.
And I mean, if you think about it, I mean, we kind of started this conversation talking about how that black and white sort of binary approach to viewing any of the stuff we're talking about is antiquated and is not like a true picture of reality. And so I think like if you zoom into that gray some more, it's really just this whole continuum, right? I mean, you have this sort of standard distribution of like people and types within your organization. And like maybe on one end of this spectrum, there's like true wrongdoing where this sort of internal dilemma is occurring on, should I do it and should I not do it? And if I've done it, should I raise my hand and say I've done it or continue to hide it? But like stepping back a little bit from that, that same calculus is happening for somebody that maybe witnessed wrongdoing or that said, hey, something doesn't seem right here. I'm not really a party to it, but this seems in conflict with the values that the company has espoused. And then like there's a decision that is made there. And in the same sense, and again, this kind of multiplies across an organization because we're kind of creatures of our environment and we're so influenced by that sort of social contagion or whatever. Once you make the decision to not speak up, you're not constantly revisiting that decision. You're not constantly revisiting the decision to say like, should I ask or should I not ask? And so that creates such like a massive opportunity and a massive threat for an organization to like either do something or not do something with this asset. I think it's an asset that is the culture,
Yeah, I think I think you're absolutely right. There's going to be some points, right, where these things become really salient to whoever we're talking about in that organization. The wrongdoer, the person who is going to speak up, or even really, a leader who has a moment to reinforce or not reinforce an idea around ethics or culture. And so, what we can think about doing, or hopefully, is where can those moments happen? And so, where can we use that opportunity? The other thing is understanding that let's try to think about ethics and compliance not from okay, let's have a yearly meeting about this, or let's do this. Let's think more about risk-based approaches. Of course, I think that's become obviously like an important way of thinking about this. But let's also maybe, if there's ways to work these things and make it easier for people to make the ethical choice in their day-to-day workflow, that's always going to be more. That's going to have more chance of success than trying to find these one-off moments, right? Because otherwise what you're doing, I think you're right, is you sort of don't think about it for a long time. Things kind of move along, and then you're confronted with a moment, and we're just hoping that it's going to resonate, and you're going to do the right thing then. Instead, let's try to make it easy all the way through.
And so what do you think that is? Are those this is going to maybe sound stupid, but like, are those controls in these different situations, or is this more of a posture that an organization should sort of push out to the organization? Like, what do you think is a stronger approach to this thing?
This is going to be sort of it's probably both of those things, right? So, in some ways it's constant kind of communication and messaging, authentic, true messaging, right? Because nothing undermines or nothing creates a rationalization more than hypocrisy. It really does, right? Because all it's doing is saying, wait a minute, what you said about this isn't really true. Therefore, it doesn't really matter. It's not creating harm. So I can kind of do what I want, right? Or
the hypocrisy is almost like a free pass.
Absolutely.
In a way, especially when it's coming from an authority,
Yeah. And it actually fosters the problem that it's intended to.
It prompts
That the performative aspect of compliance, or the leader that says do this but then does something different, right? That just creates a space for rationalized wrongdoing. But if we get authentic communications and it's constant and it's embedded into what we're doing all the time, that creates, like, to me, this kind of layer, right, where I might be confronted with the opportunity wrong, and I'm sort of weighing this sort of rationalized wrongdoing, and at least that's in my mind because it's kind of infused in the organization. Okay, so that's one aspect. The other is, on the controls thing, is let's try to think about smoothing the path to doing the right thing, as opposed to you do the wrong thing and we've caught you, and therefore let's try to deal with it after the fact. Let's try to figure out ways where we can remind you of the rules, where we can give you the most opportunity to do the right thing. I just think, like, the behavioral science literature is pretty, like, if you just take it at a very high level, it's like we make decisions really quickly. We're not often thinking about them. We tend to be blind to a lot of ethical decisions. We tend to underestimate our own ethicality, right? And so we've got to make it as easy as possible. At least that's the mindset you want to have. It's not, I'm not saying this stuff is simple, but that's the mindset you want to have.
Yeah, like if water's going to flow downhill, let's not try to make it flow uphill, type of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Or let's not try to dam it after the fact, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's already and then the problem is, unless you get the monitoring and the enforcement component like just perfect, which is not easy to do, the other people in your organization are seeing a type of hypocrisy, right? Where yes, there is enforcement, but if it's not done right, it's either too heavy-handed or too light. That creates other problems. And so, we gotta think really hard. If we can get it before it happens, it's going to be much, much better.
So what you just said there, I never thought about that, but like the application of the controls or the consequence of the controls, if that's not calibrated appropriately, that can build in some perceived hypocrisy, which then can prompt the behavior that you're trying to avoid. I mean, I never thought about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of research about, like Tom Tyler, has done this incredible work on, sort of fair and justified uses of enforcement. Again, we tend to overestimate like how we can calibrate those things, but we just really want to be thoughtful and careful and transparent about what we're doing, because if not, we're tending to sort of seed the rationalization in the future, if you will.
Yeah, right. And I guess like kind of on the other end of that, if it's too heavy-handed, then people are going to be in too much of a self-preservation mode, and they're like, I don't want to go anywhere near that,
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. And so they're not going to talk about it. Okay, so that's problem number one, because then you can't discover it. And then if that's happening, first of all, you can't pick it up to fix it as a company, but also imagine your workforce, right? What they see in their day-to-day is just lots of low-level problems that people don't talk about, or people won't rise up or won't raise up to the next level. And so that gives you a feeling like either this place doesn't care, which may or may not be true, or it's so prevalent around here, so therefore what I do doesn't really matter.
I mean, it's kind of like broken window theory for like a company culture,
Yeah, and broken window theory gets a very bad rap because it was done incorrectly in a lot of places. But broken window theory sort of generally is this idea of, let's try to fix these small problems in a one-on-one manner, in a humane sort of manner, and let's try to get that before it gets out of hand, because it creates this culture or this system that actually values rule following behavior. Now, if you do it wrong, it creates all kinds of problems because you actually make it worse, which is what you saw in New York and things like that. But the underlying idea, I think, is probably a pretty good one.
So can you tell me a little bit more about, you said that like it got a bad rap because it was not applied right? I don't think I'm familiar with that.
I mean, just like, so, like one of the kind of outcroppings of misapplied broken windows theory was stop and frisk. Basically anybody that looks like they're doing anything bad, let's pull them in and things like, okay, well,
that might be a broken window. Maybe that's a broken window. We got to see.
Exactly. Yeah. Instead of what broken windows at least originally was about community policing, which is a one-on-one interaction with the community and your officer trying to solve small problems so it doesn't create a situation where everyone sort of says, you know what, nobody cares about this place, therefore it's okay for me to commit small crimes and then bigger crimes.
Well,
right?
I mean, just think about it. If you're standing in a freaking, I don't know, if there's if you're standing on a street that's littered with litter, it's easy to throw your gum wrapper down. If you're standing in a national park where you can't see anything, you're not going to do it. You're a product of it. We get all these cues from the environment we're in and how other people who are maybe more established behave. And, that like, let me ask you this. How long do you think it takes for someone when they come into a company to like feel comfortable that they have a clear picture of the lay of the land? Do you think that that's a 9-month thing? Do you think it's a month thing? Or do you think it's an instant kind of impression thing? Like, what do you think it actually is?
Boy, it's a really good question. I don't know if I've seen any research on that. There could certainly be out there about like how long it would take a person to form an opinion about a culture at an organization. If it is, if someone, in your audience or if anyone is watching this, I'd be happy to see it. I have a feeling it's a lot quicker than we think.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I think in a very short time, you've got a pretty good sense of what, quote unquote, what's really going on here. And the tricky thing is a lot of that is about individual perception, right? And so it might not be entirely accurate, all right, so we'd have to think about what can we do to change that perception and make it accurate. But I think human beings are very, very good at picking up cues. They're not always good at, the accuracy of those cues are not perfect, right? Again, looking inward, we're not always that great about that. We tend to overestimate and overestimate our own abilities. But getting a social lay of the land and understanding we are pretty good at that. We're attuned to that. That's kind of like the makeup of the human condition.
Yeah, I think like accuracy notwithstanding, our reliance on those impressions is extremely high.
Absolutely.
Like we will let those impressions govern us. I think you're right. And maybe what we're really talking about is just like an impression, right? Like, because you can't really define a culture. You can't draw it. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not a physical thing, of course. But like my impression of you or my impression of somebody I meet, that gets established, to your point, pretty quickly. And like, it's probably not totally accurate, but it's probably accurate enough. And it's probably, you're right, it's probably not like a 9-month thing where they're just like, well, I'm suspending judgment. I don't feel like I've seen enough. On your day one, you're picking up cues and you're starting to form, the sketch, the sort of crude, bulky sketch of the figure that we're talking about.
Yeah, and that puts a lot of pressure on organizations, obviously, as they think about onboarding people and all that, and because if that's the case, right, the signals that are being sent immediately are establishing what really happened, like what's really going on here, right? And we have a lot of messaging about, in training and HR and things like that about, okay, this is the values of the company, this is what we believe in, and then very quickly people find out whether that's accurate or not, and whether those signals align with what's actually happening in my small group, with my team, with my division, with my subsidiary in my part of the world that I'm at. Does that really line up or not? And I think people make those decisions fairly quickly, and then that governs a lot of at least that sort of that cloud, that soup that they're in.
So let me ask you this question. So I just find that there's like so much opportunity in like understanding human beings from like a corporate perspective, right? Like if I can actually understand human beings and I understand how they think, like you were talking about, essentially system one before, that we make all these, these sort of impulsive decisions that are kind of below the surface. And while at the same time we think we're these sort of logical, like robotic, machines, we're not. I wonder, I guess I don't think companies in general like take advantage of the influence that's available to them in the minds and hearts of their employees as well as they could. That's like my broad sort of statement. What, like, my question is why? Is it because it's hard? Is it because companies don't see the opportunity in sort of fostering this culture because that's going to translate into enterprise value if we can get it right? Like, is it that? Or do you think it's also maybe perhaps a factor like in the fact of how our economy has changed over the last 50 years, say? Like 100 years ago, industrial economy, I mean, let's say even up until, let's draw a line at like the year 2000 to say like, okay, now we're kind of getting into a knowledge work economy where like the people element is so much more important than like the machine element, you know what I'm saying? Do you feel like it's just like, well, we're just kind of new at this and we just haven't figured it out yet? Or do you feel like it's just so hard to actually, make those connections happen on the individual, employee level? Do you understand what I'm kind of getting at?
I do. I mean, listen, it's a complex question. There's obviously a lot of drivers to that. Let me give you a couple thoughts on why maybe companies aren't appreciating that. So first of all, the academic fields on which this is based, and certainly the popularity kind of in like business culture, it isn't that old. Okay. I mean, if we think about behavioral science, really understanding like the drivers of behavior, okay, we can kind of go back to we can go back a long way if we think about like Skinner and Freud and stuff like that, but really like in mainstream, understanding, it's really like the 70s or 80s when that stuff sort of picks up. And really, like super popular culture, it's probably like 2008-ish, right? That's like when Fudge comes out. So it's not like we've had this massive long history.
Good point.
In ethics and compliance, it's even shorter, right? Because we've, for whatever reason, ethics and compliance and maybe HR in some ways, but have sort of like isn't as quick as some of the other areas. I think there's a component for sure. There's this resource component, and there's this component about what's the value, right? Why should we invest in understanding and maybe bringing in people to help us understand if it's just this liability avoidance like framework, right? Because if that's the case, really ethics and compliance is just about an insurance policy, which I think it's been viewed that way for a very long time, and that's hard to kind of break out of. Then we want to understand it, but we really only need to understand it just up to this level because that will help get a regulator off our back if it happens. Okay. Yeah.
Like how well do you have to understand the airbags in your car? And also you're not buying a car because of the airbags. You know what I mean?
Right. And I'm trying in some stuff that I'm doing and my colleagues are working on, trying to change that narrative a little bit about like there is a real value to compliance and it's a value not just in liability avoidance. It actually can have kind of an offensive component, a real value proposition. Okay. So I think that's a component too. I think it's also who is determining what is focused on. So compliance for a really long time has been led by lawyers, right? And there's lots of good reasons why that's the case. not that many lawyers are like, this isn't a natural way that they think about things.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's getting better. It's changing over time, sure. So I think that's one component, sort of like who's asking the questions, right? So if you got a team
Yeah.
of behavioral scientists and psychologists and data scientists, and yes, lawyers too, but if they're asking those questions, it's a little bit different than a former prosecutor or a former regulator.
Yeah.
I have a very legalistic way of thinking about this that tends to be a very logical way, and also, is still sort of an economic kind of frame.
Correct.
Here's an incentive that should get someone to do the thing that I want. Here's a punishment that should get someone to do the thing that I want, right? Because who wouldn't do it, right? You'd be crazy not to, because you're going to get punished, okay?
Right.
Just establish that actually doesn't really drive behavior all that well, and there's all kinds of studies that would show that, right? And then the other component here is I think companies are very good at this, certainly some companies, right? You look at a platform company, you look at a tech company, they know all about how to influence consumer behavior. And
Exactly.
marketing is
externally they're great at it.
externally incredible at it, okay? And frighteningly good at it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. But for whatever reason, we have decided not always to turn that lens inward to make our companies better and more ethical. And we tend to think about it in productivity, right? That's where the lens gets turned, but not so much in rule following behavior, ethicality, values, and culture. And so I think that shift is happening, but yeah, that lens has not gotten turned quite yet.
So that shift, why do you think it's so hard? Right? You said, well, it's kind of, it's just, to the extent it's part of the conversation, it's sort of like denominated in productivity gains.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I have found those productivity gains to really be based on like efficiency gains.
Yeah. Yeah.
As
absolutely.
opposed to like, I mean, if you think about the motivation triad, people do everything for three reasons, right? To avoid pain, to like essentially gain efficiency, or to like gain pleasure, kick more ass, get some benefit, right? Yeah. And so it seems like the conversation really is focused from an insurance policy perspective on the pain avoidance, regulatory, like not getting sued or something like that. And then to your point, it maybe is focused on efficiency, productivity gains. Do you feel like that top piece, which is really in my mind, the biggest motivator on why we buy the clothes we buy, and most of our actions, I think, are really driven by that pleasure-seeking thing. Yeah. Hopefully, I'm not saying too much about myself there. But do you feel like that's not part of the conversation just because this thing we're talking about is just kind of maturing and it might kind of like rise up to that? Or do you feel like that because this is harder to quantify?
Yeah.
Do you feel like it's that?
I was going to say, I mean, my initial reaction to that question is, I don't know that we've been good at figuring out the metric by which to judge that. Yeah. And if you don't have that metric, then, just from like sort of a corporate standpoint, it's hard then to incentive, it's hard to give an incentive that then allows the person to feel that good or that that positive or that benefit, whatever it is. If we haven't really figured out exactly how do we measure that and how do we put it into quantifiable terms. I mean, I also say there's also this difficulty in, from an individual standpoint, loss and like fear of loss is like can be a huge driver. But that can often, like, it doesn't translate always to what the corporate, the company's sort of level of loss is, so we always have to think about kind of like the difference between those two places and how it might change. So I guess what I'm not being very clear, but what I'm trying to get at is a company could think about, hey, listen, what happens here, I could invest in to stop it. But in the end, this is a very small problem in all the problems that I have.
Totally.
And the ultimate impact on our business is probably fairly low, right? Of all the things that we got to worry about, competition and, the next generation of the knowledge economy changing and we being left behind or whatever that is, right? So wrongdoing in an organization, it's important, but it might not be as important as that, okay? So like that's one level of thinking about it. And an individual has a whole other level of thinking about those things, right? What's my personal reputation? Am I going to keep my job? And am I going to be able to support my family? Yes, I want to excel in my organization, but those values aren't always like perfectly aligned. And so, what impacts a company and impacts a leader of a company doesn't always impact a line worker, if you will. The problem is, though, the liability flows from that line worker to the company.
True.
And so there's always this kind of like difficulty in like, how do we make those things line up the best as possible?
Maybe put it another way just to see if I'm following you, like the perceived sort of like preventative cost, let's call it that, of what, of a culture issue, whatever, or a compliance issue at the corporate level or at the leader level. If you take that amount and you divide that out over the heads of the organization, that amount is probably way lower than the perceived cost at the individual level. And so this mispricing from a corporate perspective is kind of the root of what we're talking about, because they're saying, well, what am I going to get from doubling my compliance budget or doubling my, ethics budget? It is what it is, blah, blah, blah. How much, the risk that this is going to mitigate is not really a needle mover for us. But at the employee level, it's a much higher thing. Yeah. And I think, another kind of important aspect in this is I think we as ethics and compliance people don't do ourselves any favors. And that might be that might be due to the composition of the types of, the archetypes that kind of self-select into this field. We don't do I just don't think we do ourselves any favors in like trying to make that connection and turn that light bulb, or I don't want to say any. It's just not as much as I would like to see in turning that light bulb on at the top, because it's more now than my grandfather's generation, for sure, that people care about the vibe of the company that they work in and what kind of a corporate citizen it is, and if they can feel good working there. Obviously, people didn't care that much in the 1910s when kids were falling into manufacturing machines. They're like, I'm just trying to get I don't know what they ate back then, can of beans or something, I'd imagine. But because that's 2 or 3 steps away from this decision, right? Like the culture somebody is living in is a function of like decisions that were made by leaders and by what controls they put in place and, different divisions that they've built. But the cost of not executing that well, you can't just point to it and say, like in manufacturing, if something doesn't go well, then you have a whole lot that maybe you have to scrap because there was some kind of quality problem. That's a very tangible, easy thing to identify, quantify, and fix. When it's something that's 2 or 3 steps removed, which shows up in your employee engagement rate, which is really hard to quantify, or it's showing up in your turnover rate, which is expensive, but it's kind of one of those silent costs. It's like riding your bike with like kind of slightly deflated tires or something like that. We very quickly can get used to a certain pain, right? Like if your turnover rate, for example, or your employee engagement rate is 2 or 3 points lower than your industry average, you might not notice that immediately. And you might not be able to quantify how somebody not putting their foot on the gas 70% instead of 75% or 80% shows up in your bottom line and your growth and your margin and everything else. So I feel like that's maybe a factor in this. It's like they just haven't done the math. But if you look at like the Ethisphere thing that they put out every year, the most ethical companies are always typically outperforming. Like there's a lot of statistical significance, I think, in that line above the sort of general market basket that they put out every single year. And so like we just have to, I feel like we have to get better at like making that case. But so I'm saying all this to get to this point. I find, I've started doing these like ROI sessions, return on integrity sessions with practitioners. I have a finance background, and I don't find it that hard to make the case. I mean, I'm looking at evidence. I'm trying to put a case together that can, stand up to the scrutiny of the jury, the adversary I'm trying to persuade. And you just pull data and, make that case. And so what I'm getting to is like, if this frame that I'm talking about, you agree with at some level, why do you think this function or this, this industry we're in, ethics and compliance, which is comprised of, disproportionately comprised of lawyers who all went to law school and learned presumably how to make compelling arguments. Why can't we make arguments around this ethical premium? Why can't we pull data and make a compelling argument in this case versus another case that maybe is, based on words or something? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I don't know if I have a perfect answer to that, although I will say I absolutely agree with this kind of ROI concept, and return on integrity is a nice way to encapsulate it. Um, I, you know, I've I think people have been trying to make the business case, quote unquote, the business case for compliance for a long time without, like, they've made the very soft kind of case for it, right?
Yeah, it's like pain avoidance only.
Yeah, exactly. They've basically looked at just avoiding cost in some ways. And then when they've tried to make the more, what I would call kind of the more robust case, which is like, all right, let's connect compliance value or compliance benefits or ethical culture benefits to some, market share or stock price or whatever it might be. That gets very fuzzy. It gets very, very difficult to make in a real way. And so I think in some ways, listen, if I'm a business leader, and like you said, like, I can do the math, okay, and I can look at this and say, okay, I hear what you're saying, but like, you're not showing to me at a level that's probably going to really convince me. I may want to do it. There's a million reasons to do it otherwise, aside from the business case, just because it's the right thing to do. There are going to be benefits in retaining, employees and stuff like that. I think most leaders understand that, right? If you got a company that's well run and the culture is positive and people feel good, that's a good thing generally, right? But I think making that ROI case more concretely and specifically as to individual, kind of like compliance provisions or actions, I think that is what you can do. But why haven't we done that before? That's not really what lawyers are actually great at. They're great at making arguments, but they've got to be able to do that analysis on the front end. And I'll admit to myself, like, I have to rely on my colleagues here to do real sophisticated work like that, because that's not my training and background.
Got you.
What has helped me being in a business school, and I feel like it is a real advantage here, is I'm just exposed to that type of thinking and that thinking all along. I forget, did you and your brother both went here, right? Is that right? Okay? Yeah,
that's
right. It's Kelley School, right? Kelley does a great job at training business young people how to do just like the basics of business, man. Like, you 100%. Can build a spreadsheet, you can build a model better than anyone. We'll put our students up against anyone. Not everyone has that background, and not everyone that's interested in compliance, which again tends to be a lot of lawyers. They don't all have that, right? That nuts and bolts sort of stuff. Now, you can learn it, but you gotta want to learn it, and you gotta understand.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
that's a phenomenal point, because I was just kind of reflecting back to what you were saying before, when you're like, well, if you have a bunch of lawyers driving this stuff, well, they're going to ask lawyer questions. If you have a bunch of behavioral scientists, they look at the world through a different lens and they see different things, and they're going to ask those different kind of questions. I think you're right. I think the background that I have is finance. And so those numbers, spreadsheets, all that stuff, I just can see it in there. And I think I don't appreciate maybe how hard it is to see if you don't have that kind of a background.
Yeah, I mean, now, and certainly people can cross over. People do.
For sure.
I was just at a kind of conference. Matt Galvin, is a name you may know. I mean, talk about a guy who's a lawyer. Talk about a guy who is like can talk data better than just about anyone that I've seen, and he's helping to build these programs, and he's sort of a visionary in these areas. Like, there's a guy, right, who really has kind of a lawyers and a prosecutor and a regulator's mentality, but also can understand the data component. Okay, so that's amazing. I just think those people are hard to come by, and they tend to be leaders, and that's fantastic. But if we just like the run-of-the-mill company or the run-of-the-mill compliance program or smaller compliance function has to think about, like, what's the team that I can build, right? Like, so maybe I don't need a full-time, behavioral scientist, but there's somebody in marketing that understands about these topics, because that's literally what they do day to day, right? So can we grab them for a project, or can we grab some data visualization, or can we grab our comms person to tell the story once we've got the story, to help build the argument, Like, I think we as compliance have not thought creatively enough about like what we can build, as opposed to just like, okay, I got to dot an I, or dot an I and cross a T to get to the next, get over the next hurdle that I have to face.
So let me bounce this off of you. I'd like to get your perspective on it because I couldn't agree more. And I'm thinking back to this like built-in hypocrisy thing that I hadn't really thought about. I've often talked about how, kind of what you were saying, how, a company is really good with their external brand, right? Their website looks phenomenal. All their marketing sheets look phenomenal, but then they don't pay as much attention to their internal brand. Well, that's one thing, it's like, I've always visualized it as like a beach ball or a balloon. Like that has an outer surface and an inner surface. And the outer surface is what the world sees through the commercials and the website. The inner surface is obviously contains all those people. And that's the surface that all the people within the organization see. And I think there's also a little bit of a built-in hypocrisy in the way we treat our external and internal brand that can send such a different message. It's like, and I'm sure my company's guilty of this as well, because it feels like external, hey, we're all kind of part of this thing and so forth. But I think it can send that same kind of a mixed message. And to your point, there's people inside the organization that are experts in the things we need to elevate our profession to the next level. I was at a conference recently, and I've been talking about this a lot, and I'll probably keep talking about it for the next year until I see some movement on it. How's that? But Pat Harnett of ECI was up there, and she was showing this data, and she had 2013, 2017, 2020, and 2023. And it was from their global business survey or whatever, and they had a Likert scale, and the question was, am I part of a high integrity organization, something like that? And the data points were 61% in 2013, 60% in 2017, 61% in 2020, and then 60% in 2023. So essentially, in the last 12 years, that line has been effectively flat at 60%. So I find that kind of interesting, and I see a lot of opportunity in it. When she put that slide up in the room, people were like, the energy kind of came down. People were like, crap, man, I've been doing all this stuff and like this line isn't moving. My sort of theory, I'd love to hear your thought on that. So why don't you say, like, give me your reaction to that like there's all this work being done in compliance. There's all these new software tools coming out. This is way more of like a real job than it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago or something, right? Like it's a thing now, right? And yet, to the extent that the main mandate of this function is determined by that line has not moved. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I guess I'll say on the opportunity component, I'll pick that up, that thread up, that does give an opportunity to say, okay, well, are we really doing this? What are the opportunities to do this differently in the future? Yes, there has been changes, but listen, a lot of compliance is fundamentally input based, right? Like we are.
It's a lagging indicator in a lot of ways, to your point.
That's true. That's certainly true. And the sort of tools that we use, we're getting better, but I think again, until we face facts about, can we really understand exactly what we're trying to do and really understand that? I don't know that we're always gonna. That we're necessarily going to move the needle on some of these numbers. I mean, if you think about, the tools of the trade, kind of like the fundamental components of a compliance program, for example, those really haven't changed very much in quite a long time, right? It's a hotline, it's training, it's policies, right? And that's how we kind of still think and talk about them. I don't know there's been like massive movements from an innovation standpoint on any of that, right? I mean, yes, on the margins for sure, and there are companies that are doing it better, but again, until people turn that lens, really like focus it inward, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't surprise me entirely. But again, I think it's a huge opportunity. I will say just a second on your analogy about the balloon. I think is a really good one, right? Because you can sort of see out, but also remember that your employees came to your organization because of what they saw on the outside.
Good point.
Right? Like that is why they came there. And so if those things are misaligned, and the one that comes to mind right now is like DEI, for example, right? Where lots of companies have been talking over the last couple of years about how, innovative and how forward thinking they are about DEI. And then the political winds change, and it's like they pivot.
We're kidding. We're just kidding. Yeah.
What do you think all your employees now think, right? They came to you because you said a thing, and then they got in the organization, and now you're doing something different. Those are problems. So I guess I don't know, that's a bit of a tangent, and I don't know that we necessarily need to go down it, but I guess that's an area where you see kind of that outside inside a potential problem.
Yeah. They see this really cool ad to come work at the company, and they see these marketing slicks that are so diverse. It looks like the colors of Benetton ad or something, and then they show up and it looks nothing like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or the messaging is, we really care about this, and then
right.
Kind of care about it, but if there's something else, and it doesn't have to be about DEI, it can be about anything else, right? Like,
it's just a good example. Yeah.
Culture or anything else, or we care about values and
environment,
following the rules, and then a senior person does a thing, and because they're a high performer or whatever, there's a different standard applied to them. Those are hypocrisy creators that I think just kill your culture.
Well, my answer to my own question, which I love doing, is I think it's exactly what you said. I think, you were talking about getting creative and talking to somebody in marketing and talking to somebody from maybe the data team or something to do our job in a bit of a different way.
Yeah.
I feel like we're finally stepping into this new sort of era of ethics and compliance. And I feel like what's gotten us here isn't going to get us there. It would be a real tragedy if 10 years from now, that line is still at 60%. But I think, to your point, it's going to take doing things a little bit differently. It's going to take turning a light bulb on at the top so that the leader can see, oh, wow, this stuff actually matters for what I care most about, which are my stock options or the value of the company. Or, I don't know. I mean, so much of our job ends up then turning into, let me just keep going. So much of our job is really, I think, driven or us being successful in our job is kind of contingent on the extent to which we can actually influence behavior in human beings.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so then our job is I feel like in this new era that we're stepping into, of course, we're going to continue to need to know the regulations and read the DOJ guidance, but it's really about how do I apply that, and to what you said about water, like we have to guide that in the most easy way possible. And so in my mind, I can't imagine anything more important to learn about as a compliance and ethics person, or as somebody who cares about business ethics. I think the most important thing to learn is like behavioral science stuff. Maybe not the most, but I feel like if you're not reading, about behavioral science and how people make decisions and all that kind of stuff, and that's not kind of top of mind, it's going to be very easy to fall back into like our backup style, which is maybe more, lawyerly or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, wouldn't surprise you. I mean, that's kind of like all my work has some sort of behavioral science component. I mean, you don't have to become a behavioral scientist. First of all, you can bring people in, you can use people in your organizations, but I think it's more of like, let's have a behavioral kind of mindset, about when we're tackling these problems. And remember, this is like a Christian Hunt thing, who I know has been, on your podcast. And, just like, let's think about how human beings actually react to information and rules. And like, let's try to take that into account, as opposed to just, we're going to do it because it's been done before. And again, I'm sympathetic to compliance functions in companies because, first of all, there's a lot of path dependency. So, right, this is
good point.
Things have been around for a long time. There's a certain cadence to what's done, and there's certain things that have to be done. Regulators mandate it, and then the guidance that they're getting from regulators. If we want to think of just like, I tend to come at this from kind of like criminal law perspective. Listen, what the DOJ tells you, you kind of have to take seriously, even though when we read that stuff, we're like, okay, yeah, it's telling us something. But if I was going to design a compliance function from the very beginning with no baggage, I would not do it how they told me to do it. And if you think about, how did those things come about? How did the original organizational sentencing guidelines come about? It came about because a bunch of judges, mostly, and yes, they had input from business people, but they got together in a room and were like, we got to create this thing. Let's look at what's been done in the past. Okay, that's how the guidelines were created. Okay, so all they were doing is drawing on things on those past minutes, right? And it's not like
pulled it all onto the path that was already there. Yeah,
it's not like they said, okay. And first of all, it's been, it was in the early 90s, right? 1991, right? They didn't say, let's get the leaders in behavioral science and all this stuff. Like, I mean, yes, they did pull in experts. I'm not suggesting they didn't, because I was in that organization as a fellow for a year. I have huge respect for it. But the point is, we can't act like that's, like that shouldn't be evolving, and that totally should be our playbook going forward. Because, think about your own organization. And I've done that. I have this new center, which is exciting. One of our values is, I say, golden ruled, right? In the sense that we're going to try to run ourselves like we say that other places should be run, right? As opposed to just falling back on, the stuff that we do because that's what academic centers, do generally.
Should do.
Right? Yeah. You're just trying to think about, like, listen, if we were starting this thing from scratch, what would be the best? What would we do? And that's not easy, but that's kind of the mindset you have to have. And then you also have to have the mindset of, we're going to test it and see if it works. If it doesn't, we're going to be okay trying something new, right? That's the only way you're going to actually innovate.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think when you give yourself the freedom to really focus on, like, what do I want to come out of the oven?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, what's the result I want? Well, then it gives you a lot more freedom than just, well, I'm just going to grab this recipe and I'm just going to kind of see what comes out of the oven. To your point,
Yeah. And again, I'm highly sympathetic, because if you think about a function that's under pressure for budget and things like that, and staff, the easiest thing is to demonstrate that you can do the thing that was being done before, right? Because
totally.
You can say that
it's low risk
really well,
for sure,
right? I can do this really well. It's harder to innovate, and there are some companies for sure that really are innovating in all kinds of different areas. They're pushing the envelope. It's just those are fewer and far between, which is probably why that trend line doesn't move as much as we'd like it to.
But for anyone listening, I just want to encourage them to focus on that outcome and, like, experiment a little bit, like trying something new on your next policy rollout, or trying something new on your next training, or starting to post something in Slack or Teams or whatever you use to start to drive that behavior. You got to give yourself some freedom for that. And I think, what I was struck by, I've become kind of friends with Andrew McBride, who won that Compliance Week Award last year for the work he did at Albemarle with his team. I was just so struck by when he talks about his interaction with DOJ. It seemed like he was always trying to solve the problem for himself. He was trying to get certainty for himself. I'm not saying he threw out the DOJ guidance. I'm not saying that, but it seems like he was less trying to follow. He was less trying to read the tea leaves of the guidance to see what are they actually trying to, tell me to do. And he's saying, like, all right, well, this is the result that these words on the guidance are trying to, like, articulate.
Yeah.
How can I get myself comfortable that we're moving closer to that result? And I think it was just the way he talks about it feels like at least a little bit of an innovation relative to, like, the fear that I hear people talk about with respect to getting in trouble, following DOJ guidance and all like that. And so I think anything someone can do to get some confidence to try to do something a little bit different, to move that line, that 60% line that we've seen for the last 12 plus years, is I think warranted. And I think, kind of to your point, we have to innovate this thing, or it's really going to turn into this sort of barnacle on the ship that's a true check the box function that's not going to move the needle, that everybody just kind of pays lip service to. Hey, how's it going? Yeah, great. We love compliance. We have to make it a true asset to the business if it's ever going to, like, ascend to the potential that it has,
Yeah. And I'll say a couple thoughts that come to that is, you can experiment in small ways.
Exactly.
Get some small wins, right? That can give you some runway to try something else. Think about any other business function, right? That's what they do, right? Your marketing team doesn't go out there and say, we're going to have this new program. We've never tested it. We're going to invest, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Great point.
We're pretty sure it's going to work. Right? They would never do that.
Such a great point.
They would take small dollar amounts. They do test markets, all kinds of things, right? To get a sense of what's going to happen. Okay. You can use the same mindset. You can do simple A/B testing. You don't have to have randomized controlled trials and all that kind of stuff. But if you're at a pharma company, people know how to do randomized controlled trials. Get some guidance.
Get him. Right? Yeah, exactly.
Get help from the people that are in your organization to help you to design something that's really going to matter. Okay, so that's one thing. Get a small win, then you go forward. That gives you runway. You can do more
and more confidence. Yep,
absolutely. And you can do simple experiments. Again, it doesn't take. You don't have to have a PhD. I mean, I don't have a PhD, but you can design a pretty simple experiment to give you some insight about what's going to happen going forward, and then you can get more sophisticated. The other thing is, the Wei Chen, who's a co-author of mine, is very adamant about this. That evaluation document, the DOJ evaluation document, was never intended to be a checklist or something that companies.
Right, it's guidance.
It's
not
guidance.
a mandate.
That is guidance for prosecutors. That's all that it ever was intended to be.
Interesting.
Now the problem is, of course, it does have a lot of impact on what companies do, and we can't ignore that, right? We can't just say, okay, throw it aside, because then if something does go wrong, they're going to say, well, did you look at this thing, or do you have any understanding of what's going on here? So I'm not saying that, but again, take it for like what is. I think that's who you're talking about. Your sort of colleague is like, take it for what its purpose is. Right. And then think, well, what are we here in this organization trying to do? If you are trying to predict what area of focus the Department of Justice is going to be looking at 5 years from now, what some idiosyncratic prosecutor is going to care about, or what division or group gets stood up at the Department of Justice 2 or 3 years from now, what's going to happen at, average white collar investigation is somewhere between 4 and 6 years. You cannot do that. You cannot predict that in a real way, in a way that would convince a boss or general counsel in any kind of accurate way that they would take you seriously. It cannot be done. So stop doing it and say, listen, what are our risks? What areas care? And those come from your business, not from the Department of Justice.
Correct.
Right. And so that's what we should focus on.
Well, yeah. And that was a single document.
Yes.
That every business and every industry is looking at. There's nuance and there's, industry specific risk, company specific risk. And that's what should determine it. Absolutely. Yeah. Man, this was so fun. I'm so glad you came on. We could have gone for another hour, I think.
I think so too. I mean, listen to it's fun when you find somebody who, sort of thinks about this, has sort of a similar worldview. It's not the only one. There's probably lots of other ones. That's why you got all these.
It's the right one. It is the right one.
Good. Okay. As long as we agree on that. But yeah, no, I appreciate the conversation, and just, I'll plug my center here for a second, just before I leave.
Please do.
The Center of Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics at the Kelley School. We've really revamped and expanded kind of what we're doing. So look for speakers, more focus on internal controls, business and behavioral ethics, corporate compliance, trying to think about corporate governance from a much broader standpoint. So research and trying to make this stuff applicable to business people. So stay tuned.
I love it. I mean, I do believe that we're at this inflection point, and it's the work that people like you and your center is doing that's going to help give the confidence and give the tools and give the information to those practitioners that have boots on the ground to really drive the change that we see possible forward,
Yeah, we hope so. I mean, that's the idea, and try to break down some of these silos between academic work and really making it actionable for business people. Because I think that's the other thing that we haven't really touched on, which is there's so much great work out there, and it's a challenge for business people. Just like when I was a practicing lawyer, I wasn't reading. I mean, I did a little bit, but it's just hard. You got a day job.
You got a life.
You know what I mean? Like you can't understand every cutting edge new paper and help decipher that. But that's what a center could be, is a conduit for that, and also can be a place where we can bring people together to have these kind of conversations. So we're going to keep doing that, and I appreciate this one as well.
Yeah. Well, follow Todd on LinkedIn, man. I get a lot of good information from you, and that center is really cool. So check that out as well. All right, man. Well, thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
All right. Go Hoosiers. Thanks.
Go Hoosiers. Yeah.
All right.